Good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are, colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us in our last CLAMS meeting. And I am certain that it's going to be a fantastic panel, as has been the tradition. And we have, as you can see, we have a host of erudite.
You've muted yourself, I fear.
Okay, so I was mute and I will start again. Thank, thank you very.
It's happened again, I'm afraid.
My God. Okay. Now, how about now? I'm okay, right? Yeah. Okay. Um, I'm sorry. I had myself on mute. Thank you very much for joining us, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I hope wherever you are, you have had a productive, relaxing, and and yeah, and fine day or evening. We have an excellent panel again, as the tradition goes. Uh, Set up for you with three sort of very erudite colleagues who have worked on Sasanian Byzantine issues. And the purpose of the panel is well, sort of to bring together. I mean, the purpose of the whole clams business is that we want the parties that are sort of involved in late antiquity, the different cultural traditions and whatnot. We want to bring everything together, hopefully, for everybody to talk to each other, so to speak. So, without further ado, I'm going to start, and I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker. You know, of course, I don't need to introduce any one of our speakers to you. You know Scott McDonough, Ekaterina Nechaeva. I'm sorry, Ekaterina, I ended up. Uh, and Scott McDonough, all of whom are, you know, I would love to sit on their classes. Let's put it that way. So without further ado, we will start. We have decided that we will start with Scott, and I will introduce our speakers as their turn comes up. So Scott McDonough and Scott and Ekaterina have been very, very modest, and so has Geoffrey about their accomplishments. So okay, Scott, this is what she wants me to say about him. Besides the fact that he's brilliant, right? Is a professor of history at William Paterson University in New Jersey. His research interest lies in the social, institutional, and religious history of late ancient Western Asia, especially pre-Islamic Iran and Caucasia. He is currently completing a monograph, looking forward, Sasanian Iran, Power, Patronage, and Piety, and is beginning a new project on royal succession in the Sasanian Empire. Um, Thank you very much, Scott, for giving us the honor of joining us in this session. Without much more talk from on my side, I give the floor to you. Please.
Okay, so I'll unmute myself and also I'll show some pretty pictures. I envision my talk as being sort of an introduction to the kind of relations between the Sasanian and Roman empires from specifically the Sasanian perspective. As such, it's conceived of as kind of somewhat general talk, and I imagine many of you are perhaps beyond this, but I hope to raise a couple kind of long-standing questions I have on the subject that hopefully will be able to inspire a certain amount of debate here. So I guess the question that I came into this thinking about was, was conflict inevitable between Rome and Iran, two powers that had both had ambitions of universal rule? Now, certainly, probably many of the people in the audience might be more familiar with sort of Roman ideas of, imperium without end or things along those lines. But it's worth noting that, the Sasanians had their own kind of universalistic rhetoric, which is nicely summed up, for instance, on the inscriptions on the coins, which identify the ruler as the Mazda worshipping Lord, King of Kings of Iran and non-Iran. That the Sasanian kings saw themselves as the king of Iran Shahar, the land of the Iranians, which was not necessarily just sort of Persis or farce, but extended to anyone who was kind of culturally Iranian, both the peoples of the Iranian plateau, but those who identified with the sort of aristocratic culture of Iran, such as those in the Caucasus or Central Asia or whatever. And in that sense, the king proclaimed himself to be the supreme monarch of this new thing that the Sasanians kind of articulated, this idea of Iran as a space. The reference to the worship of Mazda on the coins presents the king as a promoter of the good religion of Zoroastrianism or Magianism, and whose duty is to suppress evil, to suppress the lie. And tied into that is this kind of eschatological idea of, that we are in this eternal struggle. Well, not eternal, that's exactly the opposite. A struggle between good and evil that will be resolved, we imagine, in the favor of good here. However, traditionally Zoroastrianism, or at least the ideas of Zoroastrianism were relatively widespread, but there's a sort of ongoing question for me about, there's certainly I think, a limit to how much the Sasanians were interested in sort of proselytizing. There were attempts at a kind of universalistic approach to Iranian religion. You could argue that some elements of Manichaeism and the presentation of Manichaeism to Shapur I intended as a kind of universal Iranian religion. But nevertheless, the king saw himself as this kind of defender of good against evil. But also the king, positioned himself in a tradition of universal rule that went back to Sargon, as king of the four corners of the earth, but articulated in a specifically Sasanian way as the ruler of both Iran and the Iranians and people from non-Iran. And particularly by the late Sasanian period, we see a lot of symbolic representations of the king as the sort of king of the entire cosmos, like on the cup of Khusro, as the king is sort of the center around which the entire universe circulates here. So there's certainly a lot of rhetoric of universalism here that corresponds in a sense to the idea that the Roman emperor was the ruler of the entire inhabited world here. But at the same time, the Sasanian kings had to bow to certain realities here. Compared to the Roman Empire, the Sasanian dynasty was considerably more stable than anything that existed in the Roman world. That the Sasanian royal family ruled Iran for a period of basically 400 years. Rule passed mostly from father to son. So at least in a sense, the empire was quite stable in that. And there was a kind of recognition throughout the Iranian world that the King of Kings was a sort of exclusive prerogative of the Sasanian family here. But the reality was that in Iran, there were these sort of powerful aristocratic clans who were largely saw themselves as first, that the Sasanian king was just one among equals, that they were all of a kind of similar social class. And it was very hard for the king to get the leaders of these clans to commit their resources to imperial projects that they did not see as being in their own self-interest. Added to that was the fact that compared to the Roman Empire, Sasanian Iran lacked the Mediterranean Sea. It was far less internally connected. It was far harder to get people and material from one place to another in the Sasanian world. And so because of these things, Sasanian Iran was a lot less able to mobilize its resources, at least over the long haul than Rome was, I believe. But for the remainder of my talk, though, I'd like to talk about the complications of the sort of frontier zone between Sasanian Iran and the Roman Empire here. And my starting image was an image I took this summer from the entryway of Mor Albion Monastery above Nisibis, and kind of looking off in the distance to the vast Mesopotamian plain stretching all the way down to the Persian Gulf from the Tor Abdin here. Nisibis is a particularly interesting case to me, in part because we have a number of documents related to Nisibis. Most interestingly, at least that I'll talk about, the fact that we have a number of letters from the Bishop Barsauma, Christian Bishop Barsauma, written in the 480s. These have been translated in Geoffrey and Liu's book with the sources on frontier relations here. But in these letters, which at least ostensibly refer to Barsauma's various problems and complications with the Christian Church of the East, he repeatedly mentions the issues of the frontiers. He says, in fact, in this letter that he's considered sufficiently important in Nisibis that the local Sasanian governor, Kardagh, and the King of Kings want him to stay in Nisibis because he knows about the matters of the frontiers, from which I took the title. And in fact, several of these letters, he talks about things that are going on the frontiers. He says, that at one point he calls on the Catholicos, the head of the Church of the East, to excommunicate some troublemakers in the city of Nisibis before they blacken the reputation of Christians in this important border city. He talks about how drought and famine have challenged the relations between Rome and Iran, particularly in causing Arab tribes in the area to raid into Roman territory. And he also talks about various kind of diplomatic missions between the Sasanian and Roman representatives, including at one point when the Roman dux, or the military commander or governor, came to Nisibis, and their kind of high-level meetings were interrupted by word that Arabs had raided Roman towns that almost brought the negotiations to an end. Nisibis was a complicated place. It had started out as a Roman city, one of many fortified frontier cities, but it passed into Sasanian hands after the death of the Roman Emperor Julian and the peace settlement in 363. However, the region, and I'll come back to the slide in a second here, was a somewhat confusing one in the sense that there were very odd jogs of what we might consider to be the frontier here, that Procopius talks about how sort of a little further to the east of Nisibis, there was a fortress controlled by the Romans. Below that fortress was a chunk of land called the Field of the Romans, which belonged to Roman control, despite the fact that it took 3 days travel, as he says, between through Sasanian territory to get to it. So it was a pretty complicated area. It was also a place where official contact between traders from the Roman Empire and Iran were expected to pass through Nisibis. It was the seat of the Roman governor, or sorry, the Sasanian governor of the province of Arbayastan. It was the seat of a bishop, a metropolitan bishop of the ecclesiastical province of Beit Arbaye, and it also was a place that was jam-packed with all sorts of monasteries, particularly by the 6th century, which were located in the hills and above Nisibis. The city itself had a history of religious division and turmoil, and a number of revolts against Sasanian rule. And also the nearby area was home to a number of pastoralist Arab tribes that continually, at least in the eyes of the people who worked out of Nisibis, caused problems for the settled powers in the region. Now, Nisibis was just one of many sites along the long frontier between Iran and Rome, which arguably could be seen as stretching all the way from the Eurasian grasslands down to South Arabia and Yemen. But the core region of this frontier was the region of what we might consider to be the sort of Armenian highlands, now in eastern Anatolia, and the lowlands of upper Mesopotamia here. These two core regions were quite different from each other in terms of the physical geography. The Armenian highlands represented this rugged bisected plateau or dissected plateau that ran from central Anatolia to the Iranian plateau. It was a place that was hard to move around in. You had to move through river valleys or mountain passes, things like that. It was a region that had a limited amount of fertile land, mostly confined to narrow basins. But it was a place that was very amenable to aristocratic rule because it was very defensible. The local magnates could have their little fortress up in the hills, control their fertile little valley, and hole up, and were basically very hard for settled powers to dislodge. Mesopotamia was different. Obviously, once you come down off the mountains, it's a lowland plain defined by the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. It's a much more urban landscape here, and had been an urban landscape now for almost 3,000 years by the time the Sasanians came around. And it was a place where, at least on the face of it, it seems like mobility was much more in all directions. However, at the same time, during the summer, the lack of water outside of the areas around cities could make it difficult to move armies and things like that. And it was a landscape, obviously, that was studded with these walled cities like Nisibis to serve as points of defense. The frontier region was contested for a lot of reasons. I mean, one reason obviously being that it was there, that it was the place where these two empires sort of butted up against each other. But nevertheless, it had considerable resources. The upper Mesopotamian plains and the fertile basins up in the highlands were very much contested for their agricultural wealth. The cities produced various goods. Also, the mountainous regions nearby produced a lot of gold and other mineral resources. And in fact, we have the administrative seal published by Gislin of the Zarbed, the master of gold for this region of the Armenian highlands and beyond, actually into the Caucasus. It was also a region with considerable potential military resources, especially in the highlands, which had this kind of aristocratic manpower and horsepower that could be mobilized for the purposes of either empire, Sasanian Empire or Roman Empire. And it was also a place where trade passed through. It was, both in the highlands and also in the lowlands. And we have considerable evidence of the two great powers concerned for how trade should move through the region. The Codex Justinianus tells us that trade was supposed to move through three official emporia, two on the Sasanian zone and one in the Roman zone. And the Treaty of 562 also says that trade should go through Nisibis and Dara in this area. To give you an idea of how these places were viewed, it's worth noting that Divin up on the in the Armenian highlands, Procopius sort of spends a long time praising it in his wars as land excellent in every respect, healthy with respect to its airs and waters, plains suitable for riding, populous villages, and numerous merchants who bring merchandise from India, the neighboring regions of Iberia, and practically all the nations of Persia here. Now, Divin and these cities were not especially common, though, up on the Iranian highlands, but this gives you an idea of the kind of resources that these two powers were competing over. Control over trade routes, control over grazing land for horses that could be used for cavalry, a variety of other things like that. Now, correspondingly, the people who lived in these regions, spoke different languages. And again, I'm just talking about sort of core regions where Rome and Iran butted up against each other. That you have here the sort of Armenian peoples of the highlands and other Caucasian peoples, who tended socially to be organized as these sort of noble clans that controlled large amounts of territory, substantial military resources, and who at least traditionally had these kind of traditional family connections to the elites of Iran by blood or things like that. And then in the, as you kind of move down to the lowlands, you pass through a sort of mixed region until you pass into this kind of Aramaic, Syriac-speaking cultural zone that ultimately stretched from Palestine all the way to the Persian Gulf, that was dotted with these urban centers. And, to be honest, I would like to know more about who the elites in these cities are, whether the elites are local, whether they are people who are coming in as, officials of the Sasanian state. And, I've kind of debated that a little bit about who's actually in charge in these cities. It's a little clearer in the highland regions because we have sources that are really concerned with, these aristocratic elites there. And then, in Mesopotamia, at least, you have these Arab tribes that are organized in a variety of different ways, maybe pastoralist, maybe semi-pastoralist, maybe settled. But in general, our sources present them as kind of alternately useful and disruptive to settled powers here. Now, the elites in this vast region, some of them are people that are appointed by the Sasanians or are members of aristocratic families of Iran. But occasionally particularly in Armenia, we hear about Marzbans who are of Armenian birth here. So it's not entirely clear whether the royal officials are always Iranian or whether they're people who are locals here. But certainly, there is a substantial class of people who are native to these regions, who are kind of movers and shakers, who the Sasanians have to deal with. And over time, and something I'll talk about in just a second, I'll try and go quickly here, a lot of the elites in this region end up being sort of Christian. Now, the loyalties to the elites could pretty easily shift. We hear about people who are, satraps in the case of Jovinianus, who are helping out the Romans because they feel an affinity with them. We also hear about Armenian nobles who are deeply upset with Justinian's attempt to transform Armenia into regular provinces, and they align themselves or turn away from Romans. But there are various questions about what these locals and local leaders want here. And a few years ago, I gave a paper where I argued that in many ways, at least in the highland regions, the Sasanians had an advantage because they knew what the elites wanted, that the elites wanted status in this kind of Iranian cultural sphere. And this King of Kings was the only one that could give them things that gave them this status in the Iranian world, that the Roman emperors could give money, could give other things, but those things weren't necessarily valued by Armenian aristocrats and other aristocrats who had kind of established themselves in this kind of greater Iranian sphere. Now, for the people who lived in the region who weren't elites, it's a question of whether the frontier, how much it actually existed at all. People probably had family connections on the Roman side and the Sasanian side. People moved back and forth, presumably quite regularly, for trade, for smuggling in the eyes of their rulers, for pilgrimage and worship. And the locals mostly just wanted to keep peace and order, pay their taxes, get on with their lives, and live out their lives in service to whatever god, increasingly a Christian god, that they wanted. But the rivalries of these empires, combined with natural disasters, tend to disrupt the lives of these everyday people here. Now, I mentioned Christianity. Christianity, just as the people of the frontier region were diverse, so were the Christianities that developed in this region. There seemed to be sort of distinct Christianities of the highlands and the lowlands in terms of who is in charge, whether we're talking about a kind of top-down version of Christianity or a bottom-up version of Christianity. Christians also had various sectarian divisions, something I'll come back to in a second here. And Christianity had a kind of long and somewhat spotty record with the Sasanians, in that there is this kind of suspicion, once Constantine and his successors became Christian in the Roman Empire, that the Christians were seeking to kind of betray the Iranian Empire. But eventually the Sasanians kind of legalized Christianity, adopted a sort of official forms of Christianity, or promoted official forms of Christianity in the empire of the Church of the East. Now, to get back to, I was talking about with this idea of universalism, one thing I find kind of fascinating by the late Sasanian Empire is that increasingly there's a kind of Christian idea of Sasanian universalism as well. As I say here, that the Sasanian King of Kings was supposed to be a King of Kings for the King of Kings, Christ. That just as the Sasanians increasingly admitted Christians into royal service, so the Christians came to see the Sasanian king as a kind of new Cyrus, as a protector of God's chosen people, and a defender of Orthodox Christianity against the sort of unorthodox, heretical forms of Christianity promoted by the Roman emperor here. And this was helped out by, I think, the fact that the Sasanians also, or at least Christians in the Sasanian Empire, seem to have regarded it as only a matter of time before the Sasanian kings gave up their strange adherence to Zoroastrianism and converted to Christianity. So let me just wind down. Sorry if I've gone a little long here. But to go back to where I talked about, was conflict inevitable? Certainly both sides had ideologies, sort of totalizing ideologies, universal ideologies, that they, rumbled about when they got into conflict with each other. But in practice, Sasanian ambitions generally seem to have been somewhat more constrained than trying to conquer the entire world. Nisibis served as a kind of bulwark to defend the heart of the empire from incursions that happened quite a bit before Nisibis became this kind of fortress of the Sasanian Empire. But more often, the Sasanians were concerned, wars of the Sasanians were concerned with kind of internal problems. That how do you get the Iranian aristocracy to go along with it? Well, you win victories and you give them plunder. That's how, you can get them on your side if you want them to work with you. If you fight against various peoples on the edges of the frontier and defeat them, how do you keep them loyal? Well, you turn them into mercenaries. You take the people from the eastern frontier and you put them in the west and have them conquer Roman cities, like the Chionites or Huns or other sorts of people here. And one thing I've noticed, at least in my reading, is that, it's fascinating when you hear about things like the sack of Antioch by Khusro in the 6th century, that a lot of times when you read that, it seems like more often that Khusro's interest is in extracting wealth, not in taking territory. That, cities are taken only if they don't pay up. If they don't pay a ransom, we will sack your city. If we sack your city, we will take captives, but we want to ransom them too for wealth. We want gold, we want silver. And if we have to deport people to, Iran, as was the case with the Antioch, it seems to have happened, at least in the eyes of Procopius, because of a failure of ransom negotiations here. Now, we see by the later Sasanian Empire attempts to kind of organize the empire a little more efficiently, the quadripartition of the empire under various generals here. But nevertheless, warfare represented kind of a failure here. We know a lot about it because it was a popular subject for classical historians, but in general, it seems like the Sasanians were mostly content for the borders to be stable. Obviously, there's a lot of spying, a lot of watchful waiting on the frontiers, but frankly, the Sasanians could be paid off pretty cheaply for peace. That they were willing to accept peace as long as you were willing to give them some gold here, in many cases here. And we have a lot of evidence in the negotiations. I'm sure we'll hear about this from Ekaterina, between Sasanians and Iranians here, or Iranians and Romans here. But also, very often the Romans and the Sasanians had mutual concerns. How do we control those wild Arab tribes or other people? How do we make sure that trade is efficiently organized in a way that people aren't smuggling and that we can both collect our cut of this? And how do we keep track of a population on the frontier where you have Armenians on both sides of the frontier, Syriac speakers on both sides of the frontier? How do we kind of manage the fact that our population feels more connection to people on the Roman side than maybe they do to people deeper in or up on the Iranian plateau? So I'll leave it with that. As I said, my idea is essentially here are probably more questions than answers about this stuff. But I thought, this would raise at least some kind of basic framework which people can now tear apart for the remainder of our presentation. So I apologize if I run a bit long, but let me stop my sharing and then turn the floor over to our next presenter. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. This was really, really incredible. Yes, colleagues, please don't hesitate if you want to open your mics and applaud our speakers. Yeah. But I know that everybody has applauded Scott. Thank you so much for a very, very interesting talk, which raises a lot of questions. Thank you so much. So, we are going to go to Professor Geoffrey Greatrex. Geoffrey, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, okay. So, Professor Greatrex has, you don't need to introduce him, but just for those who might not know him, he's given me a very short bio as well. Geoffrey is a professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa, Canada. His research focuses on the period of late antiquity, in particular Procopius of Caesarea and the reign of Justinian. His monograph, Rome and Persia at War, 502-532, was published in 1998, while a source book, The Roman Eastern Frontiers and the Persian Wars, AD 363-630, co-authored with Sam Liu, appeared in 2002. He has edited a translation and commentary of the Chronicle of Pseudo Zachariah Rhetor with two collaborators, and more recently brought out Procopius of Caesarea, the Persian Wars, a historical commentary, 2022. So it's fresh out of the I forget the expression. Along with the New English translation of the same work. So his collaboration with Stephen Mitchell bore fruit this year in the publication of a third edition of the history of the later Roman Empire, which expands the coverage of the previous two editions. So this short bio does not do justice to Geoffrey, or I didn't do justice to Scott either, but with no further ado, I'm asking Professor Greatrex to begin kindly.
Thank you very much, Pavna. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's very nice to be here, and I'm conscious, having glanced at the people attending this, that there are some considerable experts in the field. Whether they'll learn a great deal from what I have to say, I don't know. But what I thought I would do is, as you can see, I'm going to, ironically, since I've published a lot on the wars, I'm going to talk about other aspects to show, and sort of perhaps going in the same direction as Scott, I don't see war as the norm between the two powers. Okay, is this going to advance? Yes. So what I want to do, and I'm going to be pretty brief here, really, I'm going to try and keep it down to, let's say, 15 minutes, okay? Because I'm conscious the time is speeding by. So I want to sort of look at areas where actually the two powers have quite a lot in common. There's a lot of reciprocal influence, this sort of things. I've talked about some of these and others in a paper which you can all consult afterwards in Esperanto. So all you have to do is master the international language, and you'll be able to follow that up. So what the first thing I thought I'd mention was the dimension of medicine and health. And why this is an area where there is notable Roman expertise. The Romans had medical schools, one of them in Alexandria. I'm not saying that this was a lecture hall used for medical instruction, but most cities, at least according to the legal codes, had public doctors, archiatroi. Obviously, there's one for the palace as well in Constantinople. And there was one in Nisibis, and then actually there are ones in Iran that may owe their foundation to Christians as well. And Gundishapur and so forth. And this was all the more important because Persian kings seem to have been a bit of a delicate lot, at least some of them, which made Roman expertise all the more valuable. And a really interesting case, which coincides with and is linked to the establishment of the church in Persia, is in 410, under the reign of Yazdgard I. We find this envoy from the Roman side, Bishop Marutha of Maifakat, who's not merely a bishop, but also a doctor, and he has many language skills as well. So somebody who very much straddles the frontier, goes on several missions to Ctesiphon, heals the king, which leads him to exert quite a lot of influence. And that helps in the summoning of this council of Seleucia Ctesiphon in 410. So there's some sort of, I'm picking up on some of the things that Scott mentioned. But it wasn't just Yazdgard I, who, by the way, I suspect was happy to associate himself with Christians. And I'm thinking, I have a doctoral student who's working precisely on Marutha and who argues, I think convincingly, that a lot of his reasons for the rapprochement with the Christians are due to instability within Persia and a need to keep the throne, perhaps with the help of a religious minority. Khusro also has quite a number of health difficulties, and twice Justinian sends to him a doctor, Tribunus. And interestingly, we hear about him in sources, not only Procopius, but also Pseudo-Zachariah, quite independently. And there's other people that we hear of, other doctors who are quite prominent, sometimes used in negotiations, because obviously that'll go down well at the Persian court. And in fact, in Persia itself, particularly towards the end of the 6th century, getting into the 7th, it's quite clear that one of the factors that perhaps gave the Christians leverage and influence was their medical training. And I've got a lovely extract here from Pseudo-Zachariah that kind of makes this point. This is right at the end of the work. In fact, the work as we have it, because it just breaks off, as you can see. And I mean, obviously, it's a bit too much to take in, but you'll see the mention of Tribunus here called Tribonian, and you see he's the archiatros, the head doctor, and so on. And then you'll also notice references to influential Christians, notably the Catholicos of the Christians, so the head of the Persian church, who is close to him, Khusro, because he's a physician. And so he's got a very prominent place at court. And we're looking here probably at about 550s, 560s. And clearly you can see in the last bit, these people, physicians, as you see, there's quite a number of them, are exerting influence over Khusro, leading to some pretty impressive healthcare investment. Or would that such things were still going on today? So that's enough about health. Let's move on to art and architecture, which gives me the chance to show lots of nice images, most of which I owe to other people. This one, in fact, to Jonathan Bardil, which I'll come back to. All right. And it goes in both directions. And basically, to summarize what I want to say, drawing very much on the work of Matthew Canepa, so, credit where it's due. There's Roman influence in Persia, which some people have seen in the orthogonal city plan at Bishapur, suggestion sort of 3rd century Sasanian victories, lots of Roman prisoners who were then put to work. City building, mosaic, making. And indeed, we've got, I've got a couple of images here, one from the archives, one more contemporary, of this bridge or dam, the Bandi Kaiser. There we are from Schuster. And again, the view is that this is built with Roman engineering expertise, population as a resource. But, and perhaps this doesn't get as much attention, it seems to me, that the influence does go, of course, the other way. And the Romans seem to have been particularly taken with some Persian motifs and so forth. And what I've given you here is a translation, the English translation of a panegyric to Theodosius I. So this is late 4th century, talking about, obviously, really exaggerating Persian obeisance to the emperor, who sent triumphal animals. What are triumphal animals? Well, almost certainly elephants, and making out that he's a tributary. Note, though, that he's also sending gems and silks, and I think silks is quite important. And then the Golden Gate of Constantinople then featured subsequently, a chariot drawn by 4 elephants, no doubt linked with this. And it's been observed by Janine Balti, the Belgian scholar, that perhaps in the wake of this embassy, and with the motifs that people in Constantinople and perhaps elsewhere will have seen on the silks, then these are then, they crop up from this point, sort of basically from the 5th century in the Roman Empire. So on the left there, that's from within the Persian Empire, the ram, you can see sort of the winged ram. But on the right, and I hope you can see, it's pretty similar. That's from a mosaic from Daphne near Antioch. And then there's a silk, hard to say what, if it's Egypt, 6th or 7th century, it could be under Roman or indeed Persian control. And just a few more examples. You can see the rams going all around that mosaic of the phoenix there. Yes, I think this suggestion that this could be linked to these silks, which then spread the motifs through the empire. And clearly, they were pretty popular. And I could show you other examples. That's just a smattering, but there are others. Here we are. I've left some of this in French, which is what I did do a version of this in once. The emergence of a common culture and some examples of that. Some of them are pretty obvious, such as hunting, which obviously you find in the Roman Empire. There's Constantine, and with Khusro II equally. So, right from the start, it's not surprising that there are common strands between the two sides. We've seen this before, and we'll see it again. Yes, the Paris cameo. And the suggestion with this is, although I know its genuineness has been queried lately, but it's fairly, it's immediately clear that the person on the left is a Roman emperor. The uniform is fairly clearly depicted. But it's the sort of this type of cameo is much more typical of Roman workmanship. So it could be, again, a craftsman, perhaps one captured, who is commissioned then to do this. And then, then the issue arises, it's in Paris now. What was the point of it? I think one person suggests it's a tactless gift for the Roman court, rubbing home a point. But that brings us actually to the Roman side of things, where in Thessaloniki, for instance, they've got the Arch of Galerius. And what's interesting is there we've got this same duel, and duels are sort of classic Sasanian motif, sort of one-to-one, man-to-man combat. And there, as you see, I haven't enlarged it, but it's the Roman emperor on the left who's triumphing over Narse on the right. But the two are portrayed as equal, which is pretty much how they are on the cameo, even though clearly Shapur is the more powerful. And perhaps not as, it is in Canepa's book, actually, but it is interesting that, even in Hagia Sophia in the 6th century, we can see sort of, as I put here, palmettes and so forth, and stylized pairs of wings and so forth. You can see looking up in the narthex. And if we look at the column capitals, there again, there's these vegetable motifs, the palm motifs. You can see quite a lot of similarities. And I like putting these together as well. There's a consular diptych on the right, and that's the other on the left is Taki Bustan. The palmettes and pomegranates, friezes with palmettes and pomegranates seem to move from east to west. But there is a bit of sort of Roman influence on the other side. There you've got at Taki Bustan, a much more Roman looking winged victory, for instance, with what looks like a laurel wreath. So it goes both ways, and we're ending up with a common culture. And again, as I put down there, this is very much the thesis of Matthew Canepa in his excellent book, The Two Eyes of the Earth. And then, yeah, this is an example of in the Great Palace at Constantinople, which actually I use for the cover of my book on Procopius, and then a silk, the Prague silk from the 7th century. It gets to the point later where you can't even tell whether a silk is genuinely Persian or perhaps a Byzantine imitation. Finally, and very briefly, but it leads us into our theme of conflict, we also find on the eastern frontier, because the two sides adjoin one another for so long, you get a common military culture as well. It's becoming increasingly clear, and again, a bit of a mixture of English and French here, it's becoming increasingly clear that the Sasanians, the Persians, were very adept at siege warfare right from the start. I don't think this is a case of Roman influence, and Simon James published the article about even sort of in the tunnels, the chemical warfare that was deployed there. And you've got some images there from Europos. But, and this is sort of from the last 10 years or so, there's been a huge amount of work, very interesting work, Eberhard Sauer and many others with his team in Iran on this work on the Gurgan Wall, the sheer size of which, it's a massive project, shows harnessing of huge amounts of resources and bringing into cultivation of quite a fertile region. I'm not sure I agree with him about quite how big some of the garrisons were there, but it's clearly a massive operation. There's a couple of images for you. He sent me the one on the right there, and I'm sure all of you will have read about this, and publications continue to stream forth on this. Almost concluded. Reciprocal influence. So here's going each way. So on the left, a Persian helmet, but the Romans later adapted helmets of that form for their own use. While on the right, you've got a dead Persian from the tunnels at Duro who wore mail armor, and it looks as though that was a sort of piece of equipment which they had adopted from the Romans. Finally, this is my last image. Well, and it sort of leads us into the military side of things quite well. And here we actually have the Romans actually integrating a detachment of Persian heavy cavalry, and then recruiting them and then dispatching them to campaign against the Goths in Italy. He captures some on the frontier. Perhaps we'll come back and talk about that frontier area, which Scott discussed. And that is quite rapidly, but that is a sort of another aspect of the whole frontier. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey, for that enlightening talk. Raises a lot of questions, and we're going to get to it. Just like Scott's talk. I would like us now to proceed, and I'm very, very happy to introduce Professor Ekaterina Nechaeva, who is a junior professor. We consider you a senior professor, a junior professor at the University of Lille. She specializes in late antique history with a focus on international affairs, relations between Rome and Sasanian Persia, diplomacy, and across-the-border migration and mobility. Her current project, for which she has gotten a substantial, if I'm not mistaken, grant, her current project, Expatria, centers around prosopography of conflicts. contacts and circulation between Rome and Iran in late antiquity. This fascinating subject, Ekaterina, we are all ears and we are looking forward to your talk. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for organizing it, Parvana, and for inviting us and bringing us together, and for the generous presentation as well. So I'll start right away, and I think we distributed the order in which we talked really well, because I will now focus on and zoom on some particularities, and I hope what I will very briefly try to show you, to describe to you, it actually will build on what Scott and then Geoffrey were talking just now. So I would like to talk just a little bit on the individuals and persons, yes, representatives mostly of elites, as you know, we're mostly informed of them, behind all these relations and conflicts between the two empires, and particularly, oops, I'm sorry, the prosopography of conflicts. Yes, as Parvana has mentioned, the project I'm trying to build and to create prosopography of conflicts and contacts and circulations between these two empires. So the frontier is obviously at the center of it, as are the interactions and mutual influences, and as I will try to also show from a different perspective, a completely shared and mutual culture, which we'll see is demonstrated by different means, I think, and I will speak about defectors and captives, and it is maybe a paradoxical way to demonstrate a common culture, but I think it still is. So there are, I will focus, and I focus in what I do on particular two aspects of mobility, of possible displacements of individuals, how and in what circumstances they not just cross the border, but more or less temporarily cross the border, or are brought, forced to, constrained to cross the border between the state, namely captivity and defection. These two cases, defection in different shapes and forms of it, military desertion, but not just. And though these two categories, they are obviously very different, I think that significant parallels can be drawn between the two. As a matter of fact, for high-profile individuals between the two empires, it often did not matter that much how were they captured as captives, or were they voluntarily, you know, or if they voluntarily moved across the border to join the other state. What happened next was very similar. Please do. It was very similar for both categories, which I think is an interesting situation. So people were crossing the border between the two states, as I was saying, and having both of these empires as fairly authoritarian resulted into the process of crossing of the border not being something neutral, not being something happening fairly often, especially outside of the paradigm of trade, for example, or diplomatic negotiations. But if we speak about individuals attempting to cross the border, it was not an easy enterprise. It was something that was controlled, and it was something that each of the empires tended to prevent regarding its own population. They rather preferred to control the outgoing mobility. And it was actually on the border situations, it was often done by the same means and same soldiers who were guarding the frontier from incursions from outside, but they were also having this function. And you know this famous article of the peace treaty of 562, which also may seem a little bit paradoxical from the first look at it. It states that if anyone during the period of hostilities defects between the two states, and if he should give himself up and wish to return to his home, he shall not be prevented from so doing, and no obstacle shall be put in this way. But those who in times of peace defect and desert from one side to another, they shall not be received, and actually all means should be mobilized to return them, even if they don't want to do it. Please keep in mind this interesting article of this of the treaty in 562, because I think we have different evidence of such circumstances. It's curious, I think, that in a peace treaty it's acknowledged that both empires can do nothing about, really cannot control the mobility and the desertion during the periods of hostilities and during the military actions, but at least for the times of peace, it's proclaimed and it's supposed to be controlled. I will just show you without going into too many details, because it's really very, very prosopographical and not spectacular to show. But some case studies, some examples of the mobility of different types and sorts of defectors, and then of what's happening afterwards to them. So employment, for the purposes of this presentation, please forgive me the use of these modern and somewhat not precise terms probably, but you see what I mean. So some examples from the 4th century, and a lot of them are fairly well known, as for example, the move of Hormisda, the prince who comes from the Persian Empire to the Roman Empire, and he is, well, the Romans probably have their political plans for him, but he works, he serves as a cavalry commander, as a military commander, and he actively participates in military conflict between the two empires under Julian, for example. And there are many other cases that I don't think we have time, and it's not the place to study and to give all the circumstances and particularities of all the cases. Quite often this desertion, defection happens in the circumstances of sieges, when fortresses, forts, cities are being given to the enemy, being surrendered to the enemy. And then the person responsible for the surrender, and often a commander of this fortified military place, he moves to another empire and continues the military career, as you can see here in the example of a Persian Puseus, who surrendered a fortress of Anata in 363 to the Romans. Then for the 4th century, some different examples that you have, and I think many of you remember them very brightly and in a lot of details. They are described by Ammianus Marcellinus about the defection of Antoninus, who brings strategical intelligence to the Persians, and he is then employed and according to Ammianus, becomes the chief advisor of Sapor II, and we do see him accompanying the king of the kings in the military action. We have much less evidence for different reasons from the reasons of quite different situation with the number of conflicts between the two empires, but also the character of sources. So the 5th century is not that much represented, but the 6th century, on the other hand, we have a lot of this kind of mobility, defection, and treason. It's happening all the time. But my point here, what I'm trying to show to you without maybe stopping too much on the cases, is that quite often cases of such defection or switching of sides by the representatives of the military elites of both of the states, they result in them being then employed by the other state. And some stay on the side, others who are employed as military commanders. Procopius tells us gives us different examples of that, would be sent to another geographical fronts, rather to fight the Goths than to fight the Persians. But that is also not universal. There are different cases. But I think we can accept that there is a lot of continuation of military serving and continuations of military careers that happen after this turn, after this switch of loyalties. A particular case is Armenia and Armenian nobility, and that Scott, you mentioned that as well, and I think we can probably talk about that later on, because it's especially their loyalties are so mercurial, it's hard to follow on which side a person is at that moment, because it keeps changing, and I keep wondering how on earth they even could entrust them something, because it seems to be changing really every 5 minutes. So the cases for the 6th century, for example, of the three brothers representatives of Armenian nobility, Aratius, Narses, and Isaacus, they're very. We have different data about them. They are mentioned in different sources. We can somehow follow quite successful careers that they have once they are on the Roman side, but not just them, obviously. All right, but this is something that is to be expected for defectors. So to use the knowledge, to use the intelligence, to use the expertise once they join the other side, it is an asset, and we see that that kind of asset was welcome and exploited by both powers. But then the same thing kind of happens for, again, very high-profile captives. We have a little bit less of sources for that, but I would say that the tendency is the same. Here are some examples, and I'm happy to discuss more examples further. But we have examples when really prominent commanders, generals. Here we are more informed from the direction from Persia towards the Roman Empire. When they are taken as captives, But then the same thing happens. It's the same paradigm as we have seen with the defectors. Sources claim that they get assigned, they get their important military charges already within the Roman system. My personal favorite is the case of Piran Gushnaspo Margrigor, and maybe if I have time, though I'm not sure, I'll elaborate a little bit on his fate. But then there is the third part of it. So we see these representatives of really high imperial elites. They seem to quite easily switch the codes, and not just, well, moving across the border if it's not captivity, but if it's a defection, that can prove challenging in some circumstances. But then the problem of moving to another state, to often what is an enemy state, does not seem to represent a problem for the, as it would seem, the immediate use by another empire of their capacities and their knowledge and their expertise, revealing, I think, this same common ground of military culture and actually some universality of it. And but then it's not a permanent situation either, because a move across the border, be it a defection or a captivity, the agency of these people, of these persons, remain quite limited and influenced by political circumstances and still by relations between the two powers. They are not, nor the captives, nor the defectors, even in this sense, they are close, I think, to each other, because none of them remain completely, no imperial servant probably is, but they don't have their ability to then live their lives and continue their lives as they wish or as they plan, because then the release and return can happen, and that can be a forced release and a forced return. And that's, I think, a third interesting, or second, whatever, interesting aspect of these relations. So in general, if we speak about both captives and defectors, we see that the framework of diplomatic agreements and first diplomatic negotiations and then of signing of diplomatic agreement is quite naturally the situation when different kind of displaced or individuals, those movers, can be claimed back. It's also the situation when they can be exchanged, when they can be ransomed. Yes, there are circumstances when they can escape, and that's of course outside of this framework. But the classical and standard framework would be the circumstances of a conclusion of a peace treaty. And these circumstances could considerably change the fates of these movers, because some of them were probably quite keen on returning back, but absolutely not all of them, especially the defectors who were traitors, obviously, from the point of view of the place of their origin, so to say. And for example, and that's something I'm working on now, and hope that my book will be about that, are the circumstances of these displaced individuals and peace treaties, and in particular this endless, so-called endless peace treaty or eternal peace treaty of 532. You see sources for where we see information for this peace treaty, and what interests me is what's the status of different types of displaced people within this peace treaty, because a lot of exchange and a lot of extradition is happening within this peace treaty. We have to try to extract this information from different sources, because none of these sources give us this whole information. But if we compare and put together the bits and pieces, we see quite a lot. And we can, again, what I'm trying to do is to build a prosopography of these exchanges, and they are very symmetrical. Sometimes we see high-profile individuals taken captives and then exchanged within the peace treaty. And there is here, for example, for these two people, Domitiolus and Yezdegerd, there's complete symmetry even in their status, even somehow suspicious symmetry, but still. A very famous case, the Iberian refugees who were, according to the conditions of this peace treaty, they were let either stay in Constantinople, where they ended up because of a rebellion against the Persians that happened several years earlier. They could stay, they could return back to their own country. And then several years, so we can build their prosopography. And then the story of a defection can even come to catch, at least, what we see in the sources, the second generation. There is this guy, Pirannius, who is a Roman general. He has a quite prominent military career. And he's actually the son of Urgenes, the Iberian leader, who some 20 years ago rebelled from the Persians and moved to the Roman Empire. And his son, he's in the circumstances of the Roman Empire doing his military career. And then in 544, all of a sudden, we can say, there is an extradition claim for him during negotiations between Romans and Persians, and Khosroes demands his surrender of him and of this Patros. So Pirannius' father was from Iberia, and he escaped the Persian control. Patros was originally from Arzanen, and he was taken a captive by the Romans as a child. So he grows up, he's given education in the Roman Empire, and then like his whole life passes, and then there is a claim for his extradition because they are called by Khosroes, like you see, these hereditary slaves. It doesn't happen. And then coming back to what you mentioned, Scott, about the Sasanians being so eager to put the condition, well, or not, or just give us money and we will not plunder this place and we will not go here. It even happens, and that's very interesting. I think it can be interesting to compare the sums for ransom of people and these places for not destruction, not non-plunder of the places. So here also what is suggested as an alternative, oh, you just pay us for them and nothing happens. And I don't think I have the time, so I will not go further in the particularities of also another exchange of individuals that happens within this endless peace treaty. I think that the Roman general that has been taken captive and the 7 philosophers who lived but not happily as you all know, in the court of Khosrow, and then returned back to the Roman Empire, but were protected by a clause of protection. There was a symmetrical clause, as a Syriac source, the martyrdom of Margrigor demonstrates to us. So I think actually there was a symmetry, and the two very different movers, but they were exchanged within this peace treaty. So to conclude, or to try to summarize what I have shown, is that this history of relations of Rome and Persia through, well, for these particular aspects, more through the conflicts than through the peaceful relations, but even through the conflicts, and when a lot of desertion and captivity happens, it's ultimately, globally, it demonstrates a lot of unity. It demonstrates much less of boundaries in a cultural sense, if you want. It's probably a bit of a strange for a conclusion, but I think this is one of, because we can have many other more political important and diplomatically important conclusions from these situations, but on the more general level, and for the sake of our today's discussion, I think I would like to say that it probably shows a lot of shared culture that existed between the two states. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Ekaterina. Thank you so much for that very interesting talk. I'm actually looking forward to your book, and I want to see how many of my mistakes you will correct in your prosopographical. Yeah. Well, the tradition is that we usually ask the speakers to talk to each other, and you know, try to make a conversation if you want, and if not, then after that, then we go to the question and answer period, Q&A period, if you will. So yeah, Geoffrey, Ekaterina, and Scott, please go ahead.
Right. Well, I sort of suspect we may not want to take too much time with this, because we've actually taken up quite a lot of time already, and I dare say there may be questions. But I guess if I get the ball rolling, Scott, I enjoyed very much, and beautifully illustrated talk. And I thought it was interesting, this question of ideology, and I think you're right to temper ideas about ideology, and I wonder if you want to comment. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of at least Roman ideology is for public consumption within the Roman Empire, and victories over the Persians can be claimed but not necessarily won. Emperors are not above bending the truth, as in the 3rd century, Philip the Arab, for instance. It's a matter of, and what I'd propose is that, Justin II, and perhaps the Emperor Julian as well, are two rare cases of people who actually believe the ideology and go off the deep end, believing that they can stamp their will on things, and it all goes horribly wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck with the same thing for Khosrow II. That it looks like things are going very well for him for a while until everything does not. That he seems to buy into this idea of I can be the universal ruler, I can bring down Constantinople, I can take over all the richest provinces of the Roman Empire, but in the end, it seems as though neither power has the resources to sort of pull it off, and it seems like whatever the Sasanian kings are saying to their nobles, in the background there does seem to be this much more tempered ambition as far as what can we get from the other side, in terms of can we I mean, reading Procopius is fascinating as he's, as Khusro I is marching towards Antioch. It's just every city, pay me or I'll sack your city. And some of them pay and some of them don't. And eventually, to some degree, the actual sack of Antioch reads as something as a kind of comedy of errors, in a sense of, various officials who are, people who are like, well, we could give them the payment, and then the various other state officials are like, no, we won't pay. And then a small token military force comes in, so people think that they can hold the city despite the fact that the walls are crumbled from the earthquakes. And in the end, of course, Khusro plays into this ideological idea of universalism. He goes to the Mediterranean Sea, washes his weapons there, bathes in the Mediterranean, whatever. As a kind of, yes, I am the king of the four corners of the world. I am the king of kings. But then, he just turns around and goes back and tries to ransom the captives from Antioch to whoever will pay him. And, again, the payments fall through. So at least that's Procopius's approach, it seems.
I don't want to hog the discussion. Ekaterina should come in, but just to say,
Yes.
There is the debate, and Henning Böhm, suggesting that did the Persians really need or want that money, or is it purely symbolic? I mean, that is a fairly important issue, and others may want to comment.
Yeah,
I think that's exactly a very interesting issue with between ideology and the practical side of it. I don't know if we can untangle it, because I have an impression from at least the Roman side of the sources that our authors are caught up into that quite a lot as well. It's the payments, for example, the whole problem of the payments, that you cannot that's not specific for the relations with Persia either. On the one hand, you cannot acknowledge them, and texts in descriptions of payments in diplomatic circumstances, many authors are looking for the sideways to describe the payments in another way, to emphasize the non-regularity of it, to pretend that these are the diplomatic gifts, and sometimes they really seem to be caught up into their own diplomatic game, because ideologically you cannot acknowledge that you are paying to the other side, but it makes much more sense from any other possible point of view, I think.
Yeah, I mean, to add to
both.
that, I think to some degree, there's something to be said about, the humiliation of payments as a means
Yes.
of securing your power, that, it makes the King of Kings look really good to his sort of fractious nobility if he can humble the king of, if he can humble the Roman emperor and force him to extract some sort of payment from him, or and if that fails, then you can always build the better Antioch of Khusro or something as a kind of way to stick it to them in that sense. But I was really fascinated by what you were saying, Ekaterina, about these kind of cross-border things. A number of years ago, I wrote about Simbat Bagratuni and the story of him supposedly being in Roman service and then crossing over, and it particularly seems to be the case for a lot of these Armenian nobles of the region, that they seem to go back and forth to where they think they can get a better deal in terms of the frontier, but I also was quite interested in this idea of people who have been kind of taken from their family by the other side and raised on the other side. And I mentioned in my presentation the story from Ammianus Marcellinus about Jovinianus of who's the satrap, and how supposedly he developed a love for all things Roman. So while he's still a Sasanian satrap, he's busy kind of helping out Ammianus Marcellinus and showing him the way that he can do kind of reconnoiter and see the Persian army marching towards I think Nisibis in that case, but I forget. This kind of the people of the frontier is a really fascinating thing. And then, I love in Barsalma's letters, it almost seems to be, we invited the dukes to Nisibis for, lunch or, kind of dinner, or, this kind of back and forth is very fascinating to me in terms of, it would be nice to know how ordinary it is to have the dukes to Nisibis. Whether this was a sort of regular feature of these people, or whether it was reserved for, when the King of Kings approves, then you can have this. That seems to be the case in that case, because also the Marsban of Sorastan is invited up to this kind of conference or whatever. But sorry, I've gone on a little longer than I should, but fascinating stuff. Thank you, both of you. Also, Geoffrey, I should mention the winged figures put in mind the portal to Javari in Georgia has these two winged figures, very much like the sort of Roman and the Taki Bustan, and nicely positioned between the two powers. And just to plug also the thing that was used, the picture that was used as the advertisement for this, that kind of winged cross with the rams on either side is a nice mixture of the two, I think, from Armenia. But I'll shut up now.
So see, Geoffrey, you see, if I let you speak, you can make a conversation for the next 10 hours. So, but we will go to the questions of our colleagues here. There's a number of questions. First, Professor Abbasi is thinking about me, I think, with this question, because he asks, let's see, I don't know whether, okay. Professor, thank you, Scott. I am wondering if there is any direct sign or document about the view and position of Iranian aristocratic families like Parthians about the Sasanian-Roman relations. Scott. Yeah, I was wondering where are the Parthians actually, but
well, I mean, obviously, our Roman sources have this kind of they tend to jumble sort of family names, titles, all these other things here. But it's pretty clear that a number of these figures that are mentioned, like Miranes or whatever, are members of these aristocratic families that are enrolled in these military expeditions, or defending the Roman world or whatever. One thing that is interesting to me, and I haven't quite figured it out for myself, is I was struck by the division of the empire into these four kind of military sectors that's associated usually with Khusro. And what struck me about that is that it interestingly connects frontiers with core regions that are the home of these kind of powerful aristocratic families. And it seems like regions that are have estates of these families are connected to different frontiers. And I haven't had a chance to yet, but I'd be very interested in systematically looking at how that works, as far as making sure there's military manpower associated with the aristocracy in each of these sort of four sides of the empire to be committed for military purposes. And with the Roman world, you have essentially the side of the north and the side of the west, and to a lesser degree the side of the south if you incorporate Yemen or whatever. But it does seem like there is this kind of connection of one or two of the great families seems to be associated with each of these sort of military zones in an interesting way that I think hasn't really been explored. But that's maybe not coming at it from the Roman perspective. But I'm not sure whether that fully addresses the question. It's a big question.
And they actually really, Scott, they are leading. Some of them are the leading people in both wars, right, on the east and in the west. Yeah. So so I don't know. Yeah, it's a very, very big question, and a very interesting question. Jabot, thank you very much for asking it. Professor Hossein Kamali has a question for Professor Greatrex. How much do we know, and it's a multifold question, how much do we know about the curriculum of books studied by the physicians in late antique Sasanian and Roman realms? For example, was Dioscorides' pharmacopoeia included? Have any Syriac translations reached us? Was there any difference between Roman law and Sasanian, Zoroastrian law in their respective treatments? Did the education of physicians include philosophy and mathematics as well? Okay, so please, Geoffrey, you go ahead, please.
Sure. Others may want to jump in, since I'm by no means an expert on many of these areas. But to start with, yes, the training and the sort of manuals that are used. Yes, Dioscorides, that was a 6th century manuscript commissioned by Julia Nechaeva in Constantinople. So one would infer that that is there's an ongoing interest for that earlier 2nd century work. In fact, there's quite a lot of doctors from the late antique period, people like Oribasius and Aetius of Armida, and some people, he's 6th century, and some people have suggested he might have been actually a doctor at the imperial court, and even some of his gynecological observations could be linked to his contact with Theodora, which is quite an interesting argument. I have a feeling that Khusro is, I mean, he's obviously interested in Roman medicine and so forth, and I have a feeling he may commission, in fact, the sort of translation and adaptation of works, not merely medical, I think others as well, from both the Roman Empire and indeed from India. Both of those, that's in the Sasanian tradition. Yes, so as for what, as far as I'm aware, we're not terribly well informed about sort of the nuts and bolts of this. We've got the idea that there are certain places which were particularly specialized in the instruction of medicine. And yes, your question was also about medicine and philosophy and so forth. And I think, yes, medicine it's not merely going to be a concentration on medicine, it's going to be part of a wider education for certain. And that's actually, why some of the figures that we find on embassies and so forth, they have several strings to their bow, one of which may be rhetoric. They may also be a bishop or whatever it may be. And then they're also a physician, a doctor of some kind. So there is, yes, there isn't a narrow specialization, like, for instance, we find today more. But others may want to comment. I hope that answers most of the questions.
Related to the idea of the physicians, also it is interesting that we have a fair amount of evidence of the significant role of court physicians, particularly in the form of like Gabriel Sinjar under Khosrow II, as a very influential figure at court, who's a Christian as well. One thing that struck me is about this kind of centers of medicine is also that these centers of medicine, in the case of Nisibis, also are religious centers too. So minister to both the body and to the soul is kind of education as well. I think is interesting as far as the cross-border element of this. And it is fascinating to see these physicians at court, particularly under Khosrow II, because of the pull that he has both at court, but also as a Christian in kind of promoting his own sectarian vision of Christianity before Khosrow. But that's a little bit off topic.
Well, thank you for that question, Professor Kamali, and Geoffrey, thank you for answering. I wanted to ask, there are 2 more questions that I will read, but even these questions, if people want to just, talk about their questions, come on stage and speak, please, by all means, raise your hand and then come. This is terrible. This is terrible. I don't know what is why is this happening to me today?
There's a couple of questions in the chat, I noticed. One from
Yeah. Please forgive me. I just want telling everyone that they could also ask their questions if they want to do so. So the next question is from Claire Gillis. I hope I have pronounced that correctly. Claire, is for her question is for Ekaterina, and she says that a prosopography of returned defectors and prisoners is such a brilliant idea. Ekaterina, how have you determined the geographical and chronological boundaries of your subject? Approximately how many individuals and groups are included? I could tag a little question of mine to it. Why Albanians? So, yes.
Thank you so much. That's what I'm actually trying to do. I would like to say that I'm in the middle, but I'm more towards the beginning for the prosopography of returned defectors and prisoners. But for the geography and chronology of this particular study, it's easy. I'm interested in all of that happening between the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire. So the geography and the chronology is for now is just the existence of the Sasanian Empire. And what is happening is that I was expecting, when I first started to work on dissidents and kind of immigration connected to dissidents, I was claiming that its numbers they are not so numerous, so we have to. It's hard to find them in the sources because they are not often eagerly mentioned by the authors. But as a matter of fact, already from classical sources, plus the Syriac sources, especially of course for the 6th century, when it is so dense and thick, and we have good sources for that. For the endless peace treaty, I think there are several. I'm approaching something like 20 something individuals with details of the prosopography is something. These are just the protagonists. When you do prosopography, then it very quickly grows exponentially, and that's what we are interested in, because we have the networks of these people and how and with whom they were connected, and then you see that it's really a very thorough net that transcends the border all the time in all the directions. And there's that's the military aspect. There are many other, for example, I didn't go into the story, which is also very well known to many of you, the story, for example, of a religious dissident, so to say, John of Tella, that's happening around the same years. And it's a different, absolutely different kind of a story, why he crosses the border from the Roman to the Persian side for a Miaphysite in the context of more and more critical situation for him and for the communities within the Roman Empire. But then what's fascinating is how Syriac source his life describes to us a joint operation, a cooperation between the Romans and the Persians in extradition of these fugitive, say. And there are ecclesiastical forces on the Roman side acting together with military forces, and they communicate across the border. They find the middleman to talk to Marzaban and to ask him to commission him to organize a search party to find this John of Tella hiding on the Sinjar mountain. And he's been arrested by the Persians. And then when the Marzaban first talks to him, the accusation is, well, you rebel against the Caesar. So this is why, and you have no right to be on our territory. And that's actually the border, as I see it, could be quite penetrable in all the circumstances, both of peace and of war. But then if there was something about a particular person, a particular individual, particular circumstances of someone's life, and he was wanted and he was needed, then he was identifiable. And then all these laws and rules started to play. And so he was extradited to the Romans because he was, during the times of peace, on a foreign territory without a formal permission, and because there was a claim for his extradition from the Romans. So that's a fascinating story of, it's not that much on the state level, like supreme state level, it's a little bit lower, and it's this wonderful example of collaboration in extradition just of one person. So I hope to have a lot of this prosopography. I'm sorry, I got too excited about the topic.
No, Ekaterina, that's great. But there are two other very interesting questions, and I have questions. So please keep your replies a little bit.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's okay. So Laye Ziai Bigdel.
I can read my own. If you can hear me. Sorry, I'm in a coffee shop. If it's too loud, let me know. Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you all for a great presentation, and thank you, Pavan, for arranging this. I was very curious about Armenian mines and whether that sort of possession of those mines between the Romans and the Sasanians, because it seems to be oscillating between one another, and whether we can say what particular time period the Sasanians might have had hold on it. It seems to me, reading the sources, that between Yazgerd and Kavod, that the Sasanians have a good hold of the Armenian mines, but it's an impression that I get. So I was wondering if we can talk about those in relationship to having the mines and the economy of either party, and sort of making some sort of correlation between the two.
Thank you, Laye. That's a very good question. Please pick it up, Geoffrey or Scott and Ekaterina. Anybody. This is a very important, very interesting question. The mines, the gold mines.
Yes, I don't know if anybody else. I'm having recourse. I've got a copy of my commentary here, which is, in a sort of way, it's Procopius who tells us obviously about this defection. So that's for Ekaterina. Yes, here we go. Ghazar Parpetsi reports how the mine, which was the property of the Persian crown, was administered by a local magnate, Vahan Mamikonian, in the 480s, and Tim Greenwood has written on that about the discovery of Sasanian seals that refer to an administrator of this region. In fact, I think that's the one that you showed, Scott.
Yeah, the Zarbed, the master of gold, and it seems to be a larger area. I mean, not just Armenia that's included on the seal itself. It seems to be the whole kind of Trans-Caucasus.
It's also in Malalas mentioned, and I'd forgotten that, refers to a mine on the border between the two powers, which apparently had been discovered in the reign of Anastasius, which passed from Persian control to Roman after a time when they both administered it, interestingly. So that's in Malalas.
Yeah, I had wanted to mention something about, it would be very interesting to look at instances of sort of co-dominium over certain things like this gold mine and other, because I do know there are a few instances of kind of joint control over.
Well, Cyprus under which is partitioned, with the Romans and the Islamic armies in the 7th century would be another example.
What's interesting though is, I mean, your question about the sort of economic impact of it, it's really hard to say because, I mean, certainly there's no widespread minting of gold coins. They seem to be done for, I don't know, commemorative purposes or something like that. But, certainly there's no general issuing of gold coins. And there seems to be a sort of, at least from the Roman perspective, there seems to be this voracious desire for the Sasanians for gold, constant gold. And some people, I think, have tried to make a claim of, that when they do actually produce these kind of gold coins, it's usually after victories against the Roman Empire that that gold comes in through economic predation, not through mining generally. So, I mean, I would argue, based on our limited evidence, that probably they don't have a huge economic impact, but maybe a symbolic impact of actually controlling the gold mines. But what use they're putting them to is a little hard to say from the evidence that we have.
Mm-hmm. So, Professor Antonopoulos, would you like to come on and ask your own question? Yes? No, I guess no. Okay, so the question is, greetings and thanks to all colleagues. 2 questions for Ekaterina. First, with defectors during a war, have you detected whether this was mostly their initiative or perhaps instigated with offers from the rulers of the rival states with techniques like bribery? Second, have you been able to establish the Iranian equivalent to given names in Greek, like Mermeroes, and can we thus detect aspects of their personality, such as dignity and at the same time accuracy from the part of the Greek authors? Thanks. That was from Professor Antonopoulos. Go ahead. Anyway,
thank you very much. So for the bribes, I think what we can definitely I think there was that, but we are not. There was an influence, and there are almost behind a complex and a successful defection. I think there would be a lot of organization, and there would be a lot of help from the other side. We are lucky, for example, for the 4th century, because Ammianus gives us really a very detailed description of how the defections of Antoninus and Praugasius, how they happen. And we see that there is a Persian Marzaban Tamsapor who seems to be responsible. He appears every time when there is a story of a defection. He helped Antoninus, and without his help, I don't think he would have been able to cross the border. They could have known each other. There is a Latin phrase that might mean that maybe as a merchant when Antoninus visited Persia, we don't know. But he seems to be this Tamsapor. He also comes up when spies are mentioned, as Persian spies apprehended by the Roman. He seems to try to recruit some spies from the Roman part. So for other cases, we don't have this level of details, unfortunately. But what we see is that a defection can be really complex and requires a lot of very thorough preparation and planning. It makes sense to have the other side interested and facilitating. For circumstances of really an open conflict and sieges, we have plenty of descriptions when it's being negotiated. And it's the same as for ransom. For example, the delivery of fortresses or fortifications can be is often negotiated, and that's when the conditions are also discussed and guarantees. And as Johannes Preisler Capeller demonstrated for the Armenian nobility, when they were switching sides, they were used to obtaining oaths or the guarantees of safety for and put in written the conditions on which they would switch side this time, and then probably again and again. And for the Iranian equivalent to given names in Greek, I am unfortunately not much of an expert on that, but that being said, for many of them, as the ambassadors as well, we see how we see some rules on how the Greeks tend to transform and transcribe these names, so we can reconstruct that they belonged to this or that family, like the Mihrans, for example. Of course, they are very often present. So, yeah.
Yes, if you may allow me to speak. Yes, I think it's going to be very important for your prosopographical part.
Absolutely.
If you could cooperate with some of the Iranians, if so that they can identify, just as with the diplomats, whether the names offered, especially by Procopius, but not solely by Procopius, reflect status, dignity, or actual name. I think that may teach us a lot if we can decipher this kind of thing. And apologies if things are a bit dark, but I'm totally blind, and
Yeah.
I did not venture to go and run and turn the lights on.
Apropos the names, there's an article by Schmidt, 2004, Byzantino Iranicat zum Beispiel Prokop, which is precisely about the forms of Iranian names that Procopius uses. So, that would, and Henning Böhm has also looked at this. There's good work. And just by the way, that we were just talking about Pharyngium and the bolum and the defection that Ekaterina talked about there. Well, we also hear, though he didn't feature in amongst the names you had, but of course there's the other Narses, who is described as being on site, doling out money to the people who've just come over to the Roman side. So there, if you like, is the proof. They're being, bribed, encouraged, to come over.
Yeah, the three brothers, they moved after he was Justinian was so general with Simeon. And that's actually, speaking about the mines, this episode is very interesting because Procopius claims that once the Pharangian, where the mines are delivered to the Romans by this person who is somehow responsible for guarding of the mines and gets the revenue, Justinian gets it on his side and leaves him to get the revenue. And then he's assassinated, and then another guy is assassinated. They're all assassinated, but they all keep the villages and the revenue from the mines. And that may be, speaking about the economical impact, it's not so much of an impact on the state level, but it's a way to convince the nobles and the nobility. It's an instrument of your negotiation with them.
Ekaterina,
with two
okay,
quick things.
It's the last 5 minutes, and there's
sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, so one thing is, with the defections, I'm always struck by the passage in the pseudo Morris's Strategicon, where he advises that if someone is defected to the other side, you should send a spy so that they'll be captured with the message telling the defector that it's time for him to turn his coat again, so that the other side will execute him here. The prosopography issue is, I think, a really interesting one, but it's also, I think, interesting because it might give us some insight into the sources that our Roman authors have, where they're getting their information about the Sasanian world is, might be embedded in how they receive Sasanian names and how they mutilate them in various ways. That it might be very interesting to compare Roman authors and how they use names from Iran and what that might say about their sources. But that.
Geoffrey, can you put the two references that you gave to contemporary works, and can you put it in the chat, please?
Yes, let me do that. Good idea.
Thank you. Amir Askari Yahyavi, would you like to please ask your own question and shorten it, please?
Thank you very much, Parvanjun. First, I just want to thank you all for a great set of talks. I feel, as someone here from Parthian studies informally, that this talk would have been really well served if we had a small, brief preface on the Parthians, because I feel that a lot of this would have been a little bit summarized into it. Because, for instance, with Ekaterina's talk about the prisoners, ransom, and different defections, I feel that a lot of it is an echo to the original renegade, Quintus Labienus of 40 BCE fame. Anyway, to my question, this is actually directed a bit to Scott in regards to Nasibin and Nisibis, and it has to do with the twin strategies of the city of Singara, or Mount Sinjar. It would appear that from the Sasanian perspective, or actually from the Arsacid Sasanian perspective, that these two cities actually serve as different gateways into Greater Syria. For the Romans, it appears that these are actually more of a headache, as exemplified by Trajan's campaign into Parthian Syria, and where he met with the impenetrable fortress at Hatra. So my question to you is, what sort of importance would Singara or Nisibis have given to the Romans, seen from their geostrategic perspective?
Well, I mean, one thing that strikes me is that after Nisibis is ceded to the Sasanians, there are no longer any Roman incursions into Asoristan or sieges of Seleucia-Ctesiphon. That I think that having Nisibis, having Sinjar, was a means that basically it left open the economic core of the Sasanian Empire. At least, this kind of core region of Asoristan, Babylonia, whatever. But once that is ceded, that stops. And, we see repeatedly these kind of Roman incursions from the Parthian era and then into the early Sasanian era, where Romans march right in and lay siege to cities right in the economic core. And then, as I said, after 363, no more until the end of the 6th century, and the first time is in collaboration with Khusro II and Morris, and then finally Heraclius. But that's kind of extraordinary situation. So I think it serves as a bulwark of the defense of the kind of core of the Sasanian Empire, at least economic core of the Sasanian Empire. From the Roman perspective, control of it gives them a kind of window, an easy access point, a short march down the Euphrates, into this area. So I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but at least that's how I see it.
Yeah, I think that actually is satisfied. We actually see something of it during Julian's campaign, which ended into failure. But then we sort of get into the next network of defenses where the canals are opened up. And there's actually a series of really good papers. Their name sort of eludes me, but it would appear that it gives a sort of a direct route into the Asuristan region as a whole. But it would still appear that it's more of a headache for the Romans than it is a boon for them. So it seems that once you have these two places, it sort of handicaps the Sasanian counter move, because if we look again to the Parthian era, where some of this is actually described in some detail, we see that whenever the Romans attempted to use their Armenian strategy, sort of to go into Atropatene, Azerbaijan, the Parthians would reply immediately with sorties into Syria from the Singara route. And from there, they would sort of raid the whole region, while the Romans are sort of bogged down into an Armenian winter, as we see with Marcus Antonius' campaign during the Atropatenian War. So it seems that when the conflict has achieved this maturity, because by the Sasanian era, this conflict has really matured. Now we see this micro detail into both powers sort of accepting Syria as this, no man's land, like you can see an inch here or there, but here we see that there is much more limited scope. We also see much more, much smaller forces, respectively, as opposed to the grand campaigns of Marcus Antonius or that of Pacorus during the Syrian campaign of 40 BC. So, yeah, I think that sort of satisfies it.
Thank you, Amirjan. Thank you very much for bringing that perspective on, which of course is very important to me. If you all indulge me, and if Meryl can bear with us for just a little bit longer, I ask my question, last question. And this is put to Geoffrey. Geoffrey, I know that you have you must have been tired of dealing with conflict between the Romans and the Sasanians, but I want to take you back to it. And I was wondering whether you can talk, anybody, but specifically Geoffrey, about silk economy. And yeah, I know it's I know it's but just
that's not a little question. I mean, obviously it is tremendously important. There's
in the wars,
yeah. Okay, in a few words, I mean, there's debate about when exactly the silkworms are brought to Roman territory. Constantine Zuckerman has suggested moving it up a bit earlier to the 530s, but I have a feeling someone else was telling me they're going to refute that at some point and put it back in the 550s. There is a huge appetite for silk in the Roman Empire, I suppose, just like the Persians have an unhealthy appetite for gold, so the Romans have an unhealthy appetite for silk. Justinian cooks up an idea to bypass the Persian intermediary, because they can, as we could see from the treaties that Ekaterina mentioned, and indeed Scott, there are specific, trade is limited to certain places. But if only the Romans could find a way of bypassing Persia, then they could hope to get silk more cheaply and independently of the Persians. And the Persians jealously guarded this, and that led to poor relations later under Khusro, 560s, 570s, with the Sogdians and the Turks. Khusro buys up a whole lot of silk and burns it in front of them, because he does not want the Sogdians reaching the sort of Roman Empire and perhaps dealing with them. By the way, I learned on the radio today that apparently Burberry burnt massive amounts of stock in order to stop discount prices. Just the same phenomenon in effect. So in a nutshell, that's what I would say, but others may want to add things.
Good.
I can't really say I'm anything of an expert on the topic. I mean, besides the usual things from Menander and whatever. Okay. But yeah, I think I'll leave it to Geoffrey.
Sure. We keep it to another. I mean, I would. The plan is that with the panels don't do justice to the individual speakers, and so the plan is ultimately bring individual speakers also. But everybody, please bear with us. We're going to. A lot of you are going to be invited, and we're looking forward to hearing everybody else. But for now, I really want to extend my sincere thanks, really sincere thanks, to Geoffrey, Ekaterina, and Scott for presenting to us this fantastic set of erudition that you bring, just a little bit of it, but I thank you sincerely, and all of our audience, I'm sure, thanks you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. So until next term, inshallah, we'll see you next term, inshallah. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye. Thank you.